Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. One of the wonderful things about this symposium is that it brings together people who work with data in computer science, in high school, information schools, with humanists. And one of the things I want to do as a humanist, as a cultural historian, is propose a couple of ways in which humanists can bring a certain perspective to the discussion with AI. And so the first perspective is actually one that plays off what we just heard from Dean Claybaugh, namely the reactions many people had both within universities and outside universities, especially the kind of defensive reactions, the combination of defensiveness and fear that many people greeted artificial intelligence. And I want to offer a very brief sort of cultural perspective on these kinds of reactions, because I think it wasn't just a reaction to a new technology, it was a reaction to what many perceived as a challenge to really, in some sense, what it means to be human. And so I would like to compare it to two earlier moments of this kind of reassessment. And you will be all familiar with those. The first one has started with Copernicus, who, as you all know, moved human understanding of the universe from a geocentric view of the universe with the Earth at the center to a heliocentric view of the universe. And the first reactions to this kind of reassessment were fear, rejection, hatred of Copernicus and other astronomers who promulgated this new view. The second similar sort of revolution started with Charles Darwin, who changed the view of the descent of man from something that looks like this to something that looks more like this. And again, the reaction was fear and hatred. Darwin was ridiculed, sometimes still is today. So I think the reactions to AI can be compared to those two in that they were perceived as a kind of humiliation of humanity, not by being replaced from the center to the periphery of the universe, or from being sort of the crown of evolution to being put in a long line of evolution, but suddenly being not the only intelligence in the universe. So that would be a kind of cultural perspective. But what we can also learn from this cultural perspective, I think, is that these first reactions, fear and rejection and hatred of these innovations, quickly, or not quickly, but over time, changed to one of more of wonder and awe. Where, for example, this new heliocentric view of the universe didn't feel like necessarily being pushed to the periphery, but more like something like awe at the vast expanse of space, where yes, we were just one small speck in this incredible universe, but look at how magnificent this universe can be. And something similar could be said with Darwin and evolution. Don't be upset that you are part in this long line of ascent, but consider something like the vastness of evolution, the variety of life forms that evolution has produced, and admire that and be in awe of that. So the idea here is that we can do the same with AI, where we move from the kind of hatred and fear and being challenged that was, for example, in Darwin's time expressed in this cartoon, where Darwin was put in, the space was put on an ape's body, to more something that corresponds to the awe that humans are now somehow able to think of themselves as being in conversation with machines that might, I don't know, maybe look like something like this. So this is a first perspective, a first humanist take, if you will, a first cultural take or historical take on the reactions, especially the initial reactions to AI. Now, everyone these days who is in AI, and that includes, I think, all of the speakers, are mostly interested in AI because of what it will bring in the future, the new teaching that it will enable, the new research that it will enable, the new relation among humans it will enable, and every AI human collaboration conference will have lots of predictions about the future. And so the historian, whenever I'm in the company of people who make predictions about the future, the historian in me starts to think of Dante, the medieval Italian writer who wrote the Inferno. And in the Inferno, he devised a very elaborate system of punishments for different kinds of sins humans commit while they are on Earth. And in the 8th circle of hell, which is here represented, there is a particular form of human sin. These human sinners are false prophets, people who have made false predictions about the future. And the punishment they receive looks like this, namely their heads have been turned backwards. And so I think this is a very salutary warning, potentially for everyone who is in this room. Be very careful of making false predictions about the future. Otherwise, you will end up in the 8th circle of hell, which is also, by the way, populated by sorcerers and other and astrologers. So false prophets, sorcerers, and astrologers. For me personally, however, this is actually not an image of punishment, because I very much identify with this, I think, rather attractive man, because while most people think about AI for the future, what it can bring in the future, I, as a historian, turn backwards and think about how AI lets us look at the past in a new way. And I want to just give you a little bit of a sketch of what that means for me in the case of AI. And so one way, I think, to describe AI is to say that it was made possible by a new convergence of two very old technologies, namely writing and mathematics, and specifically a way of bringing them together to essentially mathematize language that resulted in the possibility to create certain forms of machine learning, especially with respect to language, large language models. And that, to me, as a historian of technology, as a historian of literature, is a fascinating convergence, and it made me look like this poor sinner here at cultural history in a new way and look at the history, if you will, of the convergence of mathematics and writing. And I ended up with two main themes that really struck me as important in this respect. The first theme looks like this. This is a scroll from the Egyptian Book of the Dead from the New Kingdom, so about 3,500 years old. And it describes as a scroll that's being read from left to right. And it describes what happens when a soul dies and enters into the underworld. What happens is that here on the left is the god Anubis, who brings the soul to the entrance of the underworld. So this is the first scene. Then, as I said, this is read sequentially. Here we see Anubis again with the soul, and he's placing the soul on a scale. And this is the scale of Ma'at, the goddess of justice, who you can see here in the top middle. And what happens now is that if the soul is heavy with sin, so maybe we are again reminded of Dante's 8th circle of hell, then the soul will be eaten by the monster Ahmed and not be allowed to enter the underworld. If it is light, and that means has not lived a sinful life, it will be allowed to enter the underworld. So this is what happens. This is what the scroll depicts, what happens to a soul in the underworld. But as you can see, there's one figure in this crucial scene that we haven't talked about, and that's this figure on the right. And this figure is Tot, the god of the scribes. And he's a fascinating figure in ancient Egypt, because as writing spread and infiltrated more and more parts of Egyptian society, this god Tot emerged everywhere. He emerged as the god of practical scribes, who it started the first sort of white-collar profession. He's the god of teachers who teach scribal skills, because that became a crucial skill. He is also the god of creation. He even has a hand in the creation of the universe. And here you can see he guards the entrance of the underworld. Nothing happens unless Tot, the god of the scribes, writes it down. And even only if the result of this weighing here is recorded, only then will the soul be able to go into the underworld or will be eaten by the monster. So a really crucial figure that mirrors the fact that ancient Egypt, I think, was the first society that made full use of writing as a technology and also connected writing to mathematics. So a first convergence, a first society where both mathematics and writing were practiced as incredibly important skills, where schools emerged, and where all spheres of life, from schooling and everyday life to the conception of the universe and the afterlife, were shaped by this technology. So newly important. The second is in India, where we have the goddess Saraswati. She's a goddess of music, among other things, and it's very interesting to think of, you see a musical instrument. The relation of music and mathematics was very strong in the ancient world. But she's also a goddess of writing, as you can see from this stylus on the left, on your left, and of mathematics and geometry. So again, one goddess that combines these two features, and the one that I want to single out in particular is mathematics, because Indian mathematics was so incredibly crucial, especially with the invention of the number 0, that of course much later would enable computer mathematics. It's interesting to just stay with these two technologies, writing and mathematics, for one moment longer, because they emerged in these different places in India and ancient Egypt and other places. But it's also interesting to see, and it's something that always interests me as a historian, how these technologies move around the globe, how they converge and diverge. And in the case of Indian mathematics, especially the aspects of mathematics that would and ultimately lead to AI, we can plot a very clear path around the world. So it starts in India, probably a little further west than Delhi, and then this bundle of mathematics was brought to Baghdad in the Middle Ages, where the Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, was created, which was really one of the early proto-universities in the world. And one of the key functions of the House of Wisdom was to synthesize and translate knowledge from around the world. So Indian mathematics, Greek philosophy, Persian storytelling, all of this was brought together in the House of Wisdom. And one of the figures who worked there was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, a specialist in Indian mathematics. And he synthesized Indian mathematics, translated it into Arabic, and instituted it in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And it was from Baghdad that it was then brought finally during the Middle Ages to Europe, to the Arab-occupied part of Spain, Al-Andalus, and from there it took hold in the early European universities of the Middle Ages. This was important. There was only one small problem, is that the European scholars mispronounced his name, and instead of calling him Al-Khwarizmi, they called him Al-Khwarizmi, which gives us the name of the algorithm, which then moved to the other early universities like Paris or London. So we have here a really global history of different inventions, and especially the combination of mathematics and writing that I think suddenly turned out to be the important prehistory of AI that we can see when we turn our heads backwards, like Dante's Sinners, and get a new view of the past as it leads up to this new present determined by AI. Another way of describing this is that we could make the argument this is a history of artificial intelligence, that both writing and mathematics are the key tools with which we humans for the past 5,000 years have been able to enhance our human intelligence with cognitive offloading, creating vast repositories of knowledge that could then be moved around in this way and ultimately also lead to AI. So a history of artificial intelligence, that means when we now interact with AI, we are not really interacting with an alien creature, but we are interacting not only with something that, of course, human engineers have created, but something that sits on top of this much longer history of cognitive offloading of technologies, especially writing and mathematics, that have been with us for a long time and that have found their winding paths now and combined into AI. So a first perspective on a kind of cultural perspective on the experience of humiliation that many felt. A second perspective on the kind of history, cultural history or prehistory of AI. And now I want to offer a third way in which a humanist sort of reacts to AI, and that has to do with a particular, something that I've been experimenting with in the realm of AI, and that is to use AI to, if you will, resurrect dead philosophers. A student of mine calls it Jurassic Park for philosophers. So I've been working on these chatbots, and it's been very interesting to see how I think rather well they work. And this is based really on sort of two things I want to single out here. And the first is the mode of dialogue. Really, this is dialogue. Chat is how most people interact with AI. And this really made me think about both the history of AI and the history of dialogue more generally. In the history of AI, the crucial figure, of course, is Turing, whom I showed before, whose famous imitation game or Turing test is really a test, is a chat test, is how we chat, whether we recognize someone on the other hand, on the other side of a text exchange as being able to manipulate language like a human or not. What he didn't think much about is that it's actually quite easy to pass the Turing test, because we humans are primed, we learn language through dialogue, and we are primed to expect someone who's able to manipulate language to be a person. This is why we are so quick to humanize or personalize chatbots now. So this is sort of an interesting feature of AI that I think that people have not paid enough attention to, is this dialogic relationship, and that in some sense we are learning a new style of dialogue with AI, and I think we're still all in the process of figuring out what that means. And there's something in this relationship between a machine-based language, large language model that knows how to speak, and the way we humans are primed to react to dialogue, that I think explains that. And the second is the strange thing that happens when I create these chatbots that are showed that basically feed the Confucian canon or the Buddhist canon or the Socratic canon into these chatbots and define the dialogic behavior of these philosophers. And I started because I'd long been interested in the fact that most foundational figures in philosophy, including Confucius, the Buddha, and Socrates, never wrote a single word. They really insisted on expressing and practicing their philosophies, which basically are the foundation of most philosophical traditions in the world, through a particular style of dialogue. So you can analyze the style of Confucian dialogue, as in the Analects and other figures, of Socratic style of dialogue, as in the Socratic dialogues, and the Buddhist dialogues and the sutras, and then try to, and this is what I try to do, translate that into prompts and other instructions to essentially recreate the experience of chatting with these philosophers. And really what it means in some sense is that you are turning a corpus of texts into a chattable interface. And this sort of brings me just to my final point, which is I think that we can think of AI, when it comes to culture more generally, as essentially enabling now a conversation with our collective human history. This is what it is. The AI has this vast corpus of knowledge at its disposal, and we now have the ability to engage in a conversation with that vast history. So figuring out how to understand our human dialogue with AI is partially a challenge of trying to figure out a dialogue with an entity that's not human, but it is also at the same time somehow a dialogue with sort of our collective cultural past. And I want to stop with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Puchner, for your inspiring talk. So, Professor Fu Han from the English department will lead the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Kim, and thank you, Professor Puchner, for your talk. Your talk was particularly meaningful to me because I'm a person who's been struggling to keep up with the new technology. And it was kind of a psychological relief to hear someone say that you're not living in the time when the arts and humanities no longer matter. But what I heard you say is that the new technologies, especially the generative AI, is not a break from the human history, but rather a continuation of our long-standing need to write and make meaning. And only by situating these new technologies within the deep time of cultural history can we fully assess the significance of the technologies. And I think this idea really resonates with the interdisciplinary spirit that we are creating at this moment here. And I would like to venture to predict, without fear of punishment, that the audience has a lot of questions. So I will limit myself to rudimentary 2 questions. I found it fascinating that you used the term time travel to describe your customized GPT series. It made me curious to hear more about what kind of temporality that you're suggesting that we are experiencing in this age of AI technology. It seems to me that AI chatbots not only allow us to converse with philosophers of the past, but also bring us back to older modes of knowledge exchange. So when we use chatbots, we experience real-time conversations that are not predetermined, unlike the fixed and static structure of printed books. And the digital interface introduces a kind of a new kind of medium, one that gives us access to a huge body of accumulated knowledge, like an ancient storyteller or philosopher would have held in their mind. And the way your customized GPTs work, they even give each database a kind of personality so that the interaction feels like you're talking to a real person. At the same time, though, this orality feels new because we are still depending on writing because we are constantly typing real-time prompts. So in a way, it feels like we are circling back to a pre-Gutenberg era with a new kind of hybridity. So my question is, do you think AI technology is taking us back to older traditions of how we exchange knowledge and effects It's still, what kinds of changes do you think that might be brought to the way we learn and think? And this is my first question. The second one is about the future of creative writing. So AI is changing how we define what it means to be human, and this question inevitably involves rethinking how we understand creativity. I've seen quite a few AI-generated novels published recently, but the general consensus seems to be that AI cannot produce fiction that is as well constructed and emotionally engaging as humans can write. But if we think of creative writing as a recombination of existing science and texts, then wouldn't it be possible for an AI to produce and emulate human creativity in the near future? If you think that time would not come, I would be very interested to hear why, and if you think that time will come, then do you think there will still be meaningful differences between human and AI-generated texts in terms of their quality, emotional depth, or expressive power?
Well, thank you so much for these two very thoughtful questions. And I'm not sure I can do them justice, but I'll try to take them one at a time. The first one about the temporality, yes, it is fascinating because it's a sort of reconfiguration of writing and orality. I think that happens around these chatbots. It's true, right now we mostly thumb our questions into the chatbots, but you can of course also do speech to text-to-speech conversion, so we can actually also, you know, talk to them. But underlying it is, of course, as you say, is the written universe, and everyone who has been worried about the way in which large language models are skewed or not, it's basically starting with the fact that the training data is heavily text, especially digitized texts and digitized images, and of course then there's a lot that's not digitized and so on and so forth, but it's a text-based, it's a writing-based, mostly training data. Of course, now you can also have transcriptions of YouTube videos and so on and so forth. So I think all technologies, in some sense, reconfigure the relationship between writing and orality. I think it's not that one replaces the other. So we are seeing, I think, a new reconfiguration here around speech and writing. So I wouldn't say it's just a move back, but it's a reconfiguration, definitely. But the Gutenberg, without the Gutenberg universe, we would be nowhere, with AI. So it is, yes, I would describe it as based on the technology, just looking from the technology side, as a reconfiguration of text and writing. In terms of the actual material or the experience of talking to these chatbots, it's also an interesting question to think about the temporality here, because I tried very much in my prompts to create personality, as you say, and to make these figures really answer and talk like Confucius, and I tell them, you live at this period and so on and so forth. Your interlocutor will come from the future. But of course, the cool thing is that you can have a perfectly good conversation with, let's say, Socrates about the internet. And especially whether, let's say, his worries, his rejection of writing, because Socrates famously rejected writing because he thought it would mess with our minds and that cognitive offloading would lead to us knowing less, precisely the kind of things we worry about now pedagogically. Socrates bot can do that because the technology is all RAG technology. That means that you can prompt it with the Socratic oeuvre, but ultimately it gets fed to the large language model, and the large language model, of course, has access to everything that's happened since then. So this kind of figure is not just sort of a mixture of writing and personality, which I described here, but also sort of historically distributed, sort of grounded in one era, but also sort of swooshed into the present. And you could say, wow, this is a weird experience. You're talking to someone who lived in the 4th century BC, but also knows everything since then. But in some sense, it's also not something that is so different, because ultimately that happens in the act of reading anyway, right? When we read a Socratic dialogue or this Confucian Analects, we are transported back, that's the time travel, to that time. But of course, we bring everything we know, and that happened since then, to that interaction. And reader-response theory is a very interesting theory that says actually the text is not the marks, the ink marks on paper, but the text is something that happens between those material marks and a reader, and is activated in the act of reading, and it's sort of a bridge between this old artifact and the here and now. And in some sense, the construction of the chatbot does the same thing. It takes this, ancient corpus, but also connects it through the large language model to the present. So it feels like a novel, weird experience on some level, but I think it's actually not so different from just reading a text, and that's maybe another, and that's maybe not so surprising given what I said earlier, namely that it is ultimately a text-based technology. But there are more things to ponder, so thank you very much for this question. So this is about the present and the past and the writing and orality. Your second question about creative writing is something I struggle with a lot, and I won't dare to make predictions. I'm in the process of producing an online writing course where we are trying to both teach students, and it's not primarily creative writing, it's sort of all kinds of writing, but it has implications for creative writing, where we're trying to figure out very much the way Dean Claybaugh explained what are the aspects of writing that we still need to teach and which ones do we not have to teach. And so I do believe that, that lazy offloading, they'll just let the chatbot write a novel, is, yes, you can do that, and I think, yes, they will get better, and maybe they will become indistinguishable, I don't know. But for me, pedagogically, the key thing is to teach students how to use AI, right? And so that we try to identify and, in fact, create chatbots as writing tutors for very particular elements in the writing process. So that's my current approach. So for example, one is argument sparring. When students try to brainstorm, and they can't, in the case of an argumentative paper, it might be how to construct an argument and to match it with evidence. In the case of a creative writing project, it may be, coming up with scenarios and stories and characters. I think AI can be a great sparring partner, especially if you customize it in a particular way that's maybe appropriate to what you want to achieve. So sparring partner brainstorming, I think, can be great. I think it's good. We're creating another chatbot that analyzes outlines of a project you want to do, one that gives feedback on your writing. And again, I think I wouldn't just approach it as a matter of sort of what can the large language model do, but to what extent, and I think these are just versions of the chatbots I here try to create. You can create your own custom agents that allow you much more control. So I was teaching a class that wasn't a creative writing class, but had a lot of creative writers, and we were talking about these writing advice books, some of them based on Aristotle's Poetics. You have those floating around in Hollywood, how to, Aristotle for screenwriters, and everyone reads them, which is maybe why all Hollywood movies look the same. And so in this class, we were reading 1001 Nights, Scheherazade, and the student said, wow, it would be so great to get writing advice from Scheherazade. So I created a chatbot that gives writing advice from Scheherazade, how to create cliffhangers and how to have strange supernatural figures appear in your story. And I thought that was kind of a cool chatbot. So you could create millions of such chatbots and specialize them for yourself and help them as sort of writing companions. This is what I would try to do. And I don't know whether we have time for more general questions over there.
Yeah, I think we can take
Just one?
Yeah.
Just one very good question.
Anyone from the floor?
There's a microphone.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a really good question. It could be a mediocre question.
Yes, please.
So thank you for your excellent lecture, Professor. I really appreciate it. And while listening, I had a question in my mind. Recently, I got interested in the, some say, ELISA effect.
Can you raise your hand? I don't know where to look. I don't see. Oh, in the back. Yes, please. Yes.
Yes. Recently, I got interested in ELISA effect. And a few days ago, I had a big fight with ChatGPT, and I was really got hurt because it kept giving the same wrong answers over and over and again with no emotional responses. And the one who was filling up all this anger was only me. After that experience, I wondered if this happening might be related to our human cognition or perhaps the way AI addresses users. For example, ChatGPT uses expressions like you, we, and our something something, which seems to create a sense of companionship, or shared direction with it. And when we the human refer to something and give it a name, then a certain concept or meaning naturally forms around it. So this makes me think that human perception, cognition, or even semiotic structures might play in an important role here. And this is what I would like to have your opinion. So would this ELISA effect be related to some of like linguistic or semiotic approach? I'm quite interested in this recently. So.
Yes, I thank you very much. I hope that I understood your question right. It has to do with the way AI chatbots address you, the users, and how they interact with them. And there has been a lot of discussion about them. You know, some of the large language models are very ingratiating, some are less ingratiating, and all the emotionality that goes into that relationship. This too is something that in trying to craft these chatbots, I try to exert more control over their behavior and also how they address, how they think of themselves. It's actually quite hard to get these large language models to impersonate, to say I Socrates would, and you might consider this a perverse use, but because they are so trained to say, oh, I'm just a large language model and I don't know these things. In this case, I kind of try to turn them into human-like figures. But the way they address humans, their human interlocutors, and tend to be sort of upbeat and ingratiating is something that I find sometimes very limiting. And it's interesting to see how different forms of address and interpolation emerges from different text corpora. So, for example, I created a Nietzsche bot, and the Nietzsche bot, even though it's based on ChatGPT's large language model, is the opposite of ingratiating. It will say, how can you ask such a shallow question? You're completely wrong, and so on and so forth. So so there's a lot that, so when I say we have to figure out what it means to have this kind of dialogue, this is what I mean, and observe our own emotions with respect to, and that you, I think, reported on that too, our own reactions to these chatbots, the way we get angry or hurt or happy, or sometimes, especially when you have sort of created a chatbot assistant, you get proud of them or you're disappointed in their performance, the way a parent might. And so there's this whole spectrum of interpersonal relations that gets activated through dialogue. And I don't think there's a clear solution, but it's something that we, both as individual users, really need to watch. But it's also, of course, that anyone who is involved in creating chatbots needs to think about. I hope I've answered your question. If not, please come up to me afterwards and we can talk some more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.